set up to honour President Wilson, who was the only president with a PhD, a fine scholar in his own right, by providing a place in the nation's capital where scholars could come together to do policy research. And at the Wilson Centre, it has been our absolute pleasure to have, over the last few months, which have arguably been some of the most tumultuous and trying months for Australian politics, one of the nation's leading political foreign affairs journalists. Greg Sheridan is the foreign affairs editor for The Australian, which is the largest circulation national newspaper in Australia. He started his journalism career in the 1970s with the Bulletin. He's also been, I think, the Washington and Beijing correspondent for The Australian, and as I said, is now based in Sydney as their foreign affairs editor. He has an enormous range of contacts, has interviewed many leaders in the Asia Pacific, and it's been a privilege having him here, especially when there's so much to talk about in Australian politics. Today, however, he's going to talk about US and Australian geostrategic policy in the Asia Pacific, and I would ask you to join me in welcoming him to the centre.
Can I stand up?
Yeah, I think so.
Yep. Terrific. Thanks. Thanks very much indeed, Bryce. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you all for being here. And I'd like to begin by saying that you can measure a man's devotion to duty when a New Zealander intentionally says nice things about an Australian. It reminds me of the old saw that diplomacy is a good man being sent abroad to lie in the interests of his country. And it's been a pleasure to work with Bryce, except for the fact that he keeps making improper references to sporting contests between our two nations. And I'd also like to thank Bob Hathaway very much, who runs the Asia program, for inviting me to the Woodrow Wilson Centre, and also my brilliant intern, Damblin Muick. And I think if any of you find anything offensive in what I'm about to say in the next half hour or so, please take it up with Tamblin. It's all her fault. Now, I'm going to talk for about 30 minutes on the subject that Bryce mentioned, and I'm reminded of a time when Adlai Stevenson found himself addressing a similarly distinguished audience, and he reflected that for the next 30 minutes or so, it'll be my job to talk, your job to listen. If you should finish your job before I finish my job, absolutely no hard feelings whatsoever. I'm going to talk a little bit about Australia and then really just sketch what I think are three huge trends in the Asia Pacific today, and then finish by asking you all a question. And all my comments, I suppose, derive both from my work here at the Woodrow Wilson Centre and also from my work in the Asia Pacific region, where I spend my time batting around from country to country, particularly in Southeast Asia, but also in Northeast Asia. Australia, you might have heard, has recently elected an Israeli government. This is a very singular achievement for Australia, because we have a single-member constituency system which has been the most stable and indeed on some measures the most boring in the world for the last 100 years. We now have a government which stretches all the way from the extreme loony left to the extreme loony right. We have a government in our lower house. Now, we have an upper house, the Senate, which is a designated sort of Victorian attic chamber for mad relatives. But in our lower house, where the business of government gets done, we now have a government which is a coalition of a Green, an extreme left-wing independent who was formerly a Green but has now moved to the left of the Greens and left the Greens because they were foolish sellouts to the military-industrial complex, the Labor Party, and two right-wing rural independents who come from electorates which would shun the Tea Party as milquetoast and feeble, lacking in all conviction. And the Labor Party, of course, is in the middle of this, and I think Americans can best conceive the Australian Labor Party by thinking of the Chicago Democratic Party shorn of its overweening gentility and restraint, and especially in financial matters, factional matters and dynastic matters. So this weird hybrid government is now going to take us forward. It has, even with all these oddball independents, a majority in the House of Representatives of one. So I suspect it will not last its full term of 3 years. I understand the Prime Minister has issued a ban on any of her members of Parliament from jogging or taking any physical exercise for the next 3 years, because if one of them drops dead, they'll have a by-election and the government will be gone. Now, what does this mean for Australian foreign policy? Well, like most mature democracies, of course, Australia is characterised by great continuity in its strategic policy and by overwhelming bipartisanship in key matters of foreign and strategic policy. Foreign policy hardly figured in the last election. The Australian troop commitment in Afghanistan was not debated. People regard foreign policy as enormously important, but it's not a subject of party contention except at the margins, and therefore it was not debated at the last election. Both parties are completely committed to the US alliance. Both parties are, broadly speaking, free traders and committed to engagement with Asia as one of the top priorities of Australian policy. So these things are basically not discussed in election campaigns. There's a vigorous civil society debate about them, but they don't figure in election campaigns. It is interesting, though, and worth noting that the Green Party scored 15% of the vote for the first time in the recent Australian election. Now, I think that was just a protest vote, really, which would have gone to any third party. If we'd had a Liberal Democrat Party like they have in the UK, that would have scored that vote. Nonetheless, the Greens do really have policies. Apart from deindustrialisation, their other policies include opposition to the American alliance, opposition to Australian troop commitments overseas, opposition to the level of defence spending that we have now, and opposition really to our whole national security orientation. So it is noteworthy and important, I think, that 15% of Australians voted for that suite of policies, even if they were doing so primarily as a protest vote. One of the things I looked at specifically while I was here was whether the very intense intimacy which developed between the United States and Australia in national security matters under George W. Bush and John Howard had continued under new administrations in Washington and Canberra. And I think broadly it has. I think the Howard government in Australia was actually quite brilliant in its management of the US alliance, and it achieved deep structural changes for Australia in the relationship, which it institutionalised, and it was able to do so because of the subjective, to use these old Marxist terms, and if you're of a certain age and you wear a beard, you were always once a Marxist or once involved with Marxists. To use these old Marxist terms, the subjective quality of the Howard-Bush relationship allowed the Howard government to change the objective underlying realities of the US-Australia relationship. It did this in several ways. It produced a free trade agreement which sailed through with virtually no opposition in the Congress, and it produced a quite radical change in intelligence sharing arrangements between Australia and the United States, such that the no foreign or no fawn designation didn't apply to Australians in relation to operational material and material relating to Afghanistan and Iraq. Now, these were quite big structural changes in the nature of the relationship, also led to much greater intelligence and military intimacy. There are Australians now all through the American system. Indeed, one of the paradoxes of the no fawn rule is that some of the defence documents currently being worked on a no-fawn basis are also being worked on by Australians. So I suppose those Australians are permitted to write the material but not to read it after they've written it, like the old Foreign Affairs designation of a cable, eat before reading. But the intimacy there has continued at the agency level. However, there's no doubt that Obama and our former Prime Minister Kevin Rudd were not as close as Bush and Howard. The Bush-Howard relationship grew out of a particular moment in history. Howard was here in Washington for 9/11, bonded with Bush very closely, and then when Bush invaded Iraq, Howard was, along with the Brits, the only foreign nation to send meaningful troops into the invasion time, and our troops had a great time. They captured the Al-Assad air base in western Iraq, captured 57 Soviet MiGs, which was enormous fun, and the SAS guy who did it immediately sent a message back to the Royal Australian Air Force, just tell us again how many Soviet MiGs you got during the Cold War. And that was impossible to expect to be replicated under Obama and Rudd. However, Obama and Rudd did have a good thing going. They were the same generation, they were new leaders, they both replaced conservative governments, they had very similar views on the big global issues, nuclear non-proliferation, global warming, how to respond to the global financial crisis. And then Obama contrived Rudd's demise as Prime Minister by cancelling for the second time a visit to Australia. And actually, I'm joking a bit because Rudd didn't get thrown out as Prime Minister because Obama didn't come to visit. Rudd got thrown out because he'd been very autocratic with his colleagues and he'd become unpopular. However, if Obama had come to visit, Rudd would not have been thrown out because the timing would have been impossible for Rudd's colleagues to do it. They certainly wouldn't have done it while Obama was there. He would have got a boost from Obama's visit. After Obama left, he would have gone to the G20, Rudd that is. He would then have called an election and he'd still be Prime Minister today. But by such slender threads of chance hang fate. Now we have a new Prime Minister, Julia Gillard, very smart woman, Australia's second Welsh-born Prime Minister. We have an English-born opposition leader. We are a nation of migrants. We just elected our first Aboriginal member of the House of Representatives. Julia Gillard has no experience really in foreign policy and no discernible interest in it, but she's going to maintain all the policy settings the same as they were under Rudd, and she's confirmed this by making Rudd her foreign minister, and the former foreign minister, Stephen Smith, has become the defence minister. So I think the message there is of continuity, strategic continuity. The danger for Australia, I think, in the next 3 years, though, is that we lose a bit more of the intimacy with America, which will now have to invest in a new government in Australia, which may be a short-term government, and that we become very timid. Australians, as you know, are rather like Javanese in their national style, very slow to express an opinion, excessively polite, deferential. That's why we get on so well with the Indonesians. And I think this might be a very Javanese government, sad to say, because of its position in the Parliament. It will lack a certain dynamism and robustness in foreign policy. However, I think having Rudd as Foreign Minister may mean that he's effectively the Prime Minister for Foreign Affairs, and he is not especially Javanese in his outlook and his behaviour. So I think Australia is going to have an odd little interregnum until we have another election and one side or other wins properly. We don't have an electorate as big as America, but we do have 15 million voters, and it is astonishing that you can get a result which is exactly 50-50 plus 5 nuts in a parliament of 150 people. But I think nonetheless the structure of Australian-US cooperation is very secure. Now I just want to outline very briefly what seem to me 3 of the biggest trends going on in the Asia-Pacific at the moment, which I've worked on while I'm here, which I've talked to people about in State and the Pentagon and the NSC and the Hill and the think tank community, which I've had privilege to have good access to while I've been here in Washington. The first is this. Is this the year in which China disclosed to us that it is not going to behave by international accepted norms in geostrategic matters? It's too early, of course, to make this judgment, but it has been a year of very rugged behaviour from China, and it seems to me it is trying to rewrite the rules in the Asia Pacific. It is testing the United States. It's testing all of its neighbours, including Australia, and it's doing so in a fairly aggressive and rather unpleasant fashion. There are a few incidents that bear this out. The most recent, of course, is this Senkaku Islands affair, where the Chinese fisherman was fishing in Japanese islands, which are also claimed by China, and he was confronted by the Japanese Navy. What do illegal fishermen do all over the world when they're confronted by a national navy? They run away. But this guy didn't do that. He rammed the Japanese Navy. It's very hard to imagine a fisherman deciding that he wants to ram the Japanese Navy on his own bat. And a lot of analysts suggest to me that this was part of the Chinese method of, or a whole series of Chinese actions which have been testing the neighbours in recent months. The Japanese arrested the guy, not for being in their waters illegally, but for ramming their vessel. And he'd been in custody a few days when the Chinese started a huge campaign of abuse and intimidation of Japan to force them to release the fellow. Now, this contrasts, interestingly, with a case last year where the Chinese arrested an Australian executive, the number 2 in China of the Rio, the mining giant Rio. This was in the context of China being very disappointed that its state-owned Chinalco bid for a big equity share in Rio had failed, and being very upset with the prices they were paying for Australian minerals. So they simply arrested the number 2 man and charged him initially with espionage, and which of course was a completely barking mad charge, and then amended the charges to corruption and bribery. And I trust that everyone in this room is as shocked as I was at the thought that there might be corruption or bribery occurring in China. What an astonishing thing. But they just found this one Australian executive, of course, of ethnic Chinese extraction, because when they arrest foreigners, they arrest ethnic Chinese foreigners. He's still in jail. He's going to be in jail for 10 years, and they were very insistent that the due process of Chinese law had to be followed, and anyone who criticised it was hurting the feelings of the Chinese people. But in the case of the Japanese, when they arrested the fishermen for ramming their naval vessel, this became a matter of state policy and was construed instantly as an insult to China by the Beijing government. So much so that they cancelled meetings with the Japanese Prime Minister, they cancelled all high-level diplomatic exchanges, they banned certain categories of Chinese tourists from going to Japan. There was a story which later seems to have turned out to be false, that they were going to put a temporary ban on the export of rare earth metals to Japan. That seems not to have been the case. They've certainly gone very slow on approving shipments of goods to Japan, and they released a furious tirade of abuse from the media and the government of the Japanese government. Eventually the Japanese caved in and released the fellow, at which point the Chinese instantly demanded apologies and reparations for damage done to the fishing boat when the fishing boat rammed the Japanese Navy. Now, public opinion in Japan eventually forced the Japanese government to say, this is absurd, you're certainly not going to get an apology, and we would like compensation for the damage done to our Navy. Now, this is all a storm in a teacup at one level, but it's actually a pretty serious clash between China and Japan. I think the Chinese are misreading the Japanese. They feel that they've got the Japanese bluffed, that the Japanese are in terminal decline, and that the Japanese will never again resume their path of being a military power. But I think the Chinese are in tremendous danger here of making a very big miscalculation. The Japanese, if they so chose, could be ferocious strategic competitors of the Chinese, absolutely ferocious. And this is more likely to happen if the US-Japan alliance ever frays. And I believe one objective of Chinese policy is to chase the Americans out of the Western Pacific militarily. And if this ever happens, the Japanese will have to decide then between kind of capitulation to China or making their own strategic guarantees for themselves. And that could be an enormously dangerous miscalculation by China. The other two incidents, very briefly, were the sinking of the Chonan South Korean naval ship by North Korea. There's not a person in the world who thinks North Korea didn't do this. There was a team of experts consisting of Australians, South Koreans and Americans who examined all the forensic information. It's very clear that this was done by the North Koreans. The Chinese refused to acknowledge that the North Koreans did this anywhere, either at the United Nations or in private conversation or in any public forum, so that it was impossible for the United Nations to take any security action against North Korea. But consider if any other nation had done this. Imagine the reaction if Australia had shot a New Zealand boat and killed 50 people. Or the reverse. Imagine if the United States had done this. But China simply refused to allow there to be any reaction. I think this does demonstrate the continuing high-level political investment that China has in the North Korean regime. Then arising out of the Chonan sinking, the Americans and the South Koreans were going to conduct a naval exercise in the Yellow Sea involving a US aircraft carrier. The Chinese demanded that this be moved because their boats might collide. That's a very plausible proposition. American and Chinese boats might collide in the Yellow Sea. So the Americans, I think wrongly, I think they were mistaken to do this. The Obama administration moved the exercises over to the east side of the Korean peninsula, but said they would come back to the Yellow Sea with an aircraft carrier later in the year. The implication of the Chinese position, of course, is that it can determine, Beijing can determine, who can sail in the Yellow Sea, even though the Yellow Sea is indisputably international waters and indeed includes the coastal waters of South Korea. That's an astonishing implication. And the final incident concerns the South China Sea. The Chinese, as you know, claim virtually all of the South China Sea as Chinese sovereign territory. You know, if you find a bit of Chinese-looking ceramic on an atoll somewhere, you claim that this was really once part of the Chinese Empire, and therefore, for 200 nautical miles all around, it should be sovereign Chinese territory. But you only have to look at a map to see how far the South China Sea is from China. Hillary Clinton earlier this year said such claims should be based on normal land features, which is a polite way of saying the Chinese have no claim at all. At the ASEAN meeting in Hanoi, the Chinese Foreign Minister Yang Jiechi, whom I've interviewed a number of times, very smart guy, lost his temper and said to the ASEANs in so many words, "You are small countries, we are a big country, you must bend to our will." Not a good, hopeful sign for the future. So while I don't make a conclusion, I ask the question, is this the year that China tells us it's not going to abide by international norms in geostrategic matters? Second trend I'd identify in the region is the changing character of Islam in Southeast Asia. And I'll deal with this in 90 seconds. No one could admire the Indonesian president more than I do, Susilo Bambang Yudhoyono, really the best friend of civilised values that you could ever hope for in the Indonesian government. Indonesia has a magnificent record of combating Islamist terrorism. There have been more successful terror trials in Indonesia than in any other country in the world. They haven't gone before secret military commissions. They haven't been locked up forever without trial. They've gone before criminal proceedings. The overwhelming majority of them have been convicted, and this has had a tremendously educational effect on the Indonesian population about who these terrorists are and what they're up to. However, I've been visiting Indonesia and Malaysia for 30-odd years, and it's clear to me that although the Indonesian government has an excellent record and is certainly committed to moderation in all things, the character of Islam in Southeast Asia is becoming progressively more conservative, and the political discourse is becoming increasingly influenced by Middle East Islam. So local Southeast Asian Islam is traditionally easygoing, syncretic, tolerant, reflective of and inclusive of the pre-Islamic traditions of Hinduism and animism in those societies. And it is now in a kind of battle for the hearts and minds of the Indonesian people with a standardising, globalising Islam coming out of the Middle East, carried on the airwaves in Al Jazeera, but also in Western networks, in CNN, in its treatment of the Middle East, the narrative of persecution of Muslims by infidels, and of course by massive amounts of Saudi and other money going into extremely conservative mosques and pesantren, or as the Indonesians call their madrasas, and Islamic institutions. I think this is a long-term, very disturbing trend, even though the good guys are full of fight and vigour in Indonesia and there's everything to play for there. And I'm a bit unhappy that the West, meaning in this case United States and Australia, haven't done enough to engage this new Indonesia. 20 years ago there were 15,000 Indonesian students in the United States and none in China. Today there are 7,000 Indonesian students in the United States and something like twice that number in China. And there are thousands and thousands of Indonesian students in the Middle East as well. There was a long period of, in my view, foolish ban on training Indonesian soldiers in the United States, and as a result we lost a generation of Indonesian military leaders to Western influence. Yudhoyono is the last general to have been trained in the United States. Now the US has just restarted that training program, but it'll take a lot of years before a new generation of leaders comes through in the Indonesian army who've had that kind of exposure in the United States. Now the third trend, something that I'm very happy about, is in the Asia Pacific, is a serious effort by the Obama administration, in my view, to renovate and refurbish and revitalise its Asian alliances. And I'm particularly interested in this in Southeast Asia. It's certainly done so in Korea. It's had a very good relationship with Im Young-bak and his government. It's also, I think, negotiated the difficult times in Japan very well, and it survived the prime ministership of Hatoyama. Now, we journalists have a very wide level of tolerance for eccentricity in political leaders, but Hatoyama was certainly right out there at the end of the standard deviations. I regard most things as permissible by politicians and their spouses, but when Mrs. Hatoyama told us that she'd been astral travelling to Venus, where she'd met Tom Cruise, it made me wonder whether she'd disclosed any state secrets to Tom Cruise on Venus. But I do think Japanese politics is kind of self-corrected, and it's gone through the difficulty of the early DPJ days. And although I don't think America handled the Futenma base issue with great sensitivity, nonetheless, I think there was a lot of attention from the Obama administration, and the danger of real breakdown of that alliance has been averted. But what I do find very exciting is the US efforts to renovate their whole position in Southeast Asia and the South Pacific. The administration is trying to negotiate a nuclear cooperation agreement with Vietnam. Vietnam is offering military facilities to the United States Navy. There is talk of pre-positioning materiel. Who knows, we may live to see the day when there are US bases again in Vietnam. I mean, will wonders never cease? Cam would need to be refitted, I guess, but it's an astonishing development in itself. Malaysia has troops in Afghanistan in support of the American effort. It does this because it wants America to be in Southeast Asia because it's scared of China, and it's paying some dollars into the favour bank to buy some goodwill with the administration, and the administration is reciprocating. The Obama administration has rediscovered the South Pacific and has whistled up about $100 million worth of aid and activities for the island South Pacific nations, Vanuatu, the Solomon Islands and so forth. $100 million is not chump change in the South Pacific, and it's a very welcome move to have the Americans back in the South Pacific. Bryce will tell you the Americans have finally admitted their wickedness in shunning New Zealand all these decades. The Australian view is we've got to be a bit careful about this. We don't want too close an embrace with the New Zealanders, but clearly the Americans are reforging a new relationship with New Zealand and have plans, big plans for the new leadership in the Philippines, and are making a serious effort with Indonesia, notwithstanding everything that I just said. A final comment on the US-Indonesia relationship, though. It does strike me sometimes there's a paradoxical element to American policy. If you want the most difficult thing in the world done, let's imagine invading an Arab nation, installing democracy in the Middle East, America will sign up for that in the blink of an eye. But if you want them to do the easiest thing in the world, which is send their president to the biggest Muslim nation in the world, where he will be treated like a rock star and drown in waves of popularity because he went there to school for a few years when he was a kid, this is beyond the wit of American policy. This is just too hard. It's too complex. And indeed, with a kind of exquisite, brilliant sort of dystopian splendour, the administration has managed to cancel 4 visits to Indonesia, 2 publicly and 2 privately. It's now announced a visit by the president for the 5th time. And here is a nation which wants to love the president more than any other nation in the world. All 200 million Indonesians claim they went to school with the president in Menteng, you know. All he has to do is show up and he'll be loved. In fact, Indonesia is the only country where the early Obama administration's rather vain thought that Obama's character and charm and charisma would be a factor in geopolitics actually might work. And, of course, up till now the president hasn't been there. But assumingly he will go there in November, and this is simply part of an effort to renovate the US-Indonesia relationship. The US has lifted the ban on cooperating with Kopassus, the Indonesian Special Forces, lifted the ban on training the Indonesian military, and I think that relationship is set to go forward, and that's very much in the context of China. Now, my final question is really in 2 parts. I think we're coming to the end of the story in Iraq and Afghanistan, and it's good that we're coming to the end of the story. It can't go on forever. I'll tell you honestly, I supported both deployments. But these things can't go on forever, and the Americans can't want it more than the Afghans or the Iraqis want it. And while the Americans will shape things on their way out and will leave some kind of presence behind, we're coming to the end of the story when there are large numbers of troops, of American troops stationed in Iraq and Afghanistan. I think from the Asia-Pacific's point of view, this is a very good thing, because my first question is, can the US afford 2 big ground campaigns and the kind of navy that it needs to ensure stability in the Asia-Pacific? And most of the capabilities which Defence Secretary Robert Gates has talked about getting rid of in the Defence Department are capabilities which reinforce America's deterrent capability in relation to China in the Asia-Pacific. I've no doubt at all that the Chinese want to make it impossible for the American Navy to operate within 1,000 miles of the Chinese coast. Capabilities like the F-22, which contribute to allowing the American Navy to do that, are being got rid of because of financial reasons. And I think the Asia-Pacific is unhappy about that. And my final question then is what I think is the great theological question of our time, and that is, will the American economy recover sufficiently and sufficiently quickly to allow America to continue to be America in terms of its global role and the role that we all need from America, and which also sustains America's own national interests? If America can no longer be America internationally, the whole world will pay a terrible price, and not least the Asia-Pacific, where there is already an arms race. I think the narrative of American decline and exhaustion is overstated and is wrong, but in itself this is a big factor in geopolitics, just this narrative, because it encourages all America's adversaries, rivals and potential adversaries to test America out. And so the perception of weakness, even if it's not true, is a kind of weakness in itself, whereas historically the mere whisper of American power was enough to settle most things down. So I certainly believe that the United States economy will recover and that the US is a resilient society and a problem-solving society, and that America will still be America. But I think that is the question that is the question of our time. Thank you.
Okay, thanks, Greg. As we're being webcast today, I'll ask you when you ask your questions to please wait for Sue, who's going to be coming around with a microphone. If you could just raise your hands, and when I point to you and you have the microphone, identify yourself, state your name and any affiliations you might have. So who wants to go first?
Al Laporta, State Department, retired. Here in Washington, we take it somewhat at face value that the Australian defence establishment and its negativity toward defence relations toward New Zealand has really been one of the big drags in terms of kind of allowing the U.S.-New Zealand relationship to evolve. I think one drag is the United States Navy. The other one has been the Australian defence people telling us that that's a bad idea. You seem to indicate that that's not the case. So what is your kind of interpretation of about how Australia does in fact view the lapsed alliance and the issue of U.S. defence relations with New Zealand?
Well, I apologise for the sort of densely obscure oddity of the way in which I spoke about that issue, but you can see what a big bugger Bryce is, and it does kind of concentrate your mind a bit. But no, look, I'll tell you straight. For many decades, Australia was an implacable enemy of New Zealand in Washington. But the drag was not Australia, the drag was New Zealand. New Zealand has enshrined in its legislation today that nuclear-powered American vessels may not visit its ports. And the American Navy will tell you that you can't have a mix-and-match alliance. You can't have a selective alliance in which the US Navy is required to certify in advance that the ship is neither nuclear-powered nor carrying nuclear weapons, even though American ships no longer carry nuclear weapons. The problem for Australia was this, that when New Zealand adopted this policy in the mid-1980s, this was an extremely live issue in the Australian Labor Party. There was a very strong element of the party which wanted to go down the New Zealand road. Indeed, for a time, Bill Hayden, who later became our foreign minister under Bob Hawke, when he was leader of the Labor Party in opposition, he had the New Zealand policy as formal Australian policy. At that time, it was very difficult for American ships to visit Australian cities because state Labor governments would simply make it impossible by denying city facilities to them. So they could visit Sydney, they couldn't visit Melbourne. They're always very popular with the public. Indeed, the first time an American fleet visited Australia was in 1908. The Great White Fleet under Teddy Roosevelt produced in Australia the biggest crowds in the history of Australia up to that point to welcome the Great White Fleet, so named because of the colour of the ships, not the colour of the sailors. And indeed, I think about 150 American sailors didn't get back on board when the Great White Fleet left. They stayed in Australia and prospered in the way illegal immigrants do in both our societies. But I think the continuing Australian view is that we're happy for New Zealand and America to chum up now. That's a good thing. The New Zealanders themselves will generally tell you their policy is irrational. I'm happy to breach an off the record of Don McKinnon when he was Foreign Minister, who told me that the anti-nuclear ship visit policy of New Zealand made no sense, but it was too hard to change. He was a national minister, it had been a Labor Party policy. And indeed it is too hard to change. Australia's concern has been that if it appears that New Zealand can have the benefits of a very close association with the United States without bearing the costs of alliance, then that will set up a sympathetic argument within Australian politics why not go down the New Zealand line? So it's been very important that when people say you could have the benefits of the American alliance without doing any of the hard stuff of being allies, that Australian governments have been able to say, no, that's just not true. Apart from being unethical and against our political principles, it's also not true. You know, the highest a New Zealand Prime Minister has got in seeing anybody in Washington in the last 25 years has been the deputy doorman at the Willard Hotel. Now, we all understand that times have moved on. It's no longer a debate in Australia. The Australian body politic, notwithstanding the Green vote, is very committed to the US alliance. A friend of mine put it to me recently, the anti-nuclear ship policy really was a KGB policy. The KGB is not around anymore, so nobody's really following that policy. So, and similarly, New Zealand has gone out of its way to make a heroic effort in deploying its excellent soldiers in Afghanistan, and of course they're enormously important in East Timor. And although New Zealand has more or less abolished its Navy and Air Force, it nonetheless produces excellent soldiers, and in a lot of operations around the world you do need a lot more excellent infantrymen than we've got now. So I think Australia is happy for this relationship to go forward and to bring New Zealand a bit back into the strategic community. And I understand there's a sort of a partial rehabilitation into the Five Eyes Club and so on, but it's only quite partial. And you know, there were always very strict rules about how Australians could share American intelligence with New Zealanders and so forth. But we don't want the absolute distinction between an ally and a non-ally to be blurred. After all, as the great Rich Armitage once put it in a statement on the Australian media, a military alliance means you'll fight and die for us and we'll fight and die for you. And we want the distinction between an alliance and a friendship to be kept quite clear. So we're happy that the New Zealanders will become friends of the Americans again, but we want to be very clear that if they want to be allies, they would have to change policies which they're not prepared to change, and we want that distinction to be kept very clear publicly and strategically, because otherwise the consequences in our own debate will follow.
Next, up the back there. Kuniko.
Kuniko Ashizawa. I'm a new Japan fellow at Woodrow Wilson Center. Since you kind of emphasized the continuation of the strategic policy by Australian government, so I would like to know, how do you actually observe the Australian-Japan-US trilateral kind of security arrangement, which was initiated by the Howard government? Do you think this, because it became less visible in political stage in the Asia-Pacific, so do you think this is a deviation of the so-called continuation you emphasized? Or also, do you think, is there any kind of role of this trilateral cooperation in the overall picture of the Asia-Pacific strategic relationship?
Well, that's, you know, you're absolutely right to identify elements where there wasn't complete continuity. One element where there wasn't continuity was not so much the trilateral dialogue, but the quadrilateral dialogue. You remember, I think it was Prime Minister Abe's particular idea, the quadrilateral dialogue between India, Japan, Australia and the United States. Chinese were very upset about this, and the Australians pulled out of it. But as I understand it, it was a very contentious issue within the US system as well. The State Department was against it pretty much. Cheney was driving at the Vice President's office. The Howard government was, generally speaking, happy with it, but our Foreign Affairs Department was not so keen on it. In fact, that was the divide, really, I think, in all four of the Quad members, really. It was the Foreign Affairs Departments that were unhappy about it because they were worried about what cost it would bring them with China. Meanwhile, China proliferates networks and dialogues and Shanghai Cooperation Organisation, everything else, without a minute's flicker of concern about what we might think about it. You know, they could care less about what the neighbours might think about their strategic dialogues. I do think the trilateral security dialogue did have a lower profile under Rudd. That's true, but I think it continues to be intensely relevant. There's been a proliferation of these sub-regional security dialogues, and the Australians who participated in the trilateral security dialogue found it very, very useful. They found it gave them an avenue into Japanese security thinking, which they didn't fully have before, and it drew the Japanese defence folks more fully into, that kind of dialogue than they had been involved in the past. So I hope it continues to prosper, and I certainly think the last thing we should take into account is Chinese objections to democracies in good standing talking to each other, because, Beijing will find this objectionable. Well, I think that's an excellent reason to continue doing it and to, to highlight it more than ever. But of course, I'm a journalist, not a diplomat.
I'm Frances Winnie with U.S. ASEAN Business Council, and I'd like to ask you about Myanmar. Could you describe, can you comment on Australia's policy toward Myanmar, U.S. policy, and then does it even matter?
Well, that's a terrifically pertinent question. Again, I think the Obama administration has been better than the Bush administration in that it has had a policy of engagement with Myanmar. We've tried isolation on Myanmar for a long time, and it's produced absolutely nothing. It's produced no good whatsoever. I can remember writing columns saying that it was fatuous for Madeleine Albright to have her picture taken with Aung San Suu Kyi, because it just produced nothing. I fully agree with standing in solidarity with dissidents and human rights activists and all that, but it just produced absolutely nothing. And in fact, it made life worse. Before we got into our deep isolation phase, the West this is, or particularly the United States, there was US involvement in programs to counter AIDS in Myanmar and in programs to counter opium crop growing. And as a result of the isolation policy, these programs fell apart. And this became a diabolical problem for Thailand, which had waves of Myanmarese or Burmese coming across their border every day, many of whom were HIV positive. And it's just a comprehensive failure as a policy. It also became a roadblock to sensible policy for ASEAN. But I give the Obama administration high marks for having the US-ASEAN summit last week. I agree with this criticism that it should have been held in Washington and more should have been made of it. But I give the Obama administration high marks for going ahead and having the summit and including Myanmar, not at the level of Tan Shui, obviously, but at whatever level. I think it was the foreign minister who came along, and not allowing that. I mean, I think the worst thing about Myanmar policy would be if it became a roadblock to doing stuff with ASEAN. That's crazy. Indonesia is the third biggest democracy in the world. There are more Muslims in Indonesia than there are in the whole of the Middle East. This is a critically important country to engage. To have that engagement limited by the fact that Indonesia is a member, along with Myanmar, of ASEAN would be crazy. But the policy in relation to Myanmar itself has also been ineffective. That's why the Indians reversed their earlier policy and went in to try to give Myanmar an alternative to Chinese strategic domination, which Myanmar traditionally has had. It hasn't felt that it's completely in China's orbit, but in recent years I think it has been much more in China's orbit. The Australian policy has been an exquisite mixture of cowardice and hiding in plain sight. We have not adopted the American policy. The previous American policy of isolation was not the Australian policy, but nor did we have a policy of engagement much. We engaged in a human rights dialogue with Myanmar, and we had a trade policy which involved neither encouraging nor discouraging trade with Myanmar. But in effect, nobody invested there because of the American sanctions. Now, really, we're trying to engage North Korea. I think whatever Myanmar's sins are, and they are legion and many and so forth, it's crackers, in my opinion, to to have a policy of isolation of Myanmar. I think the most productive thing we could do with Myanmar would be to try to get it to resemble Thailand in the 1970s. You know, crooked generals who run crooked businesses instead of just running their people into death. You know, that would be a huge improvement for Myanmar, and that's the only likely realistic improvement. While I am full of praise for the way the Obama administration moved beyond the Bush administration's policy on this, I do fear there is a danger that they've over-egged the expectation of what's going to happen. We're not going to get a real election in Myanmar. It's going to be a fake election. The government's going to be returned. Hopefully they can do it without killing too many citizens. And I think you've got to allow it to limp along at that pace. The thing that would produce change would be decentralised economic development. That would produce political change over time. So I just hope the Obama administration holds its nerve with its engagement policy and keeps going. But, you know, I'll just finish up by saying to you that I used to write columns urging Australia to be much more proactive in its engagement of Myanmar. Now, former Foreign Minister Alexander Downer said to me once, he said, you know, mate, I agree with those columns. You're right. I want you to keep writing them so that I can argue with my department in favour of your policy. But he said, I don't want the Australian people to wake up one morning and open their newspaper and see a picture of Aung San Suu Kyi on one side of the page and a picture of me on the other side of the page, and the question asked, who is right, Aung San Suu Kyi or Alexander Downer? Because he said they're not going to pick me. And that is a bit the political problem that every Western democratic leader has in confronting Myanmar, but it's not a good basis on which to make long-term policy.
I'm Robin Walker. I'm the desk officer for Australia and New Zealand at the Department of Homeland Security's Office of International Affairs. I like to joke with my friends that the difficult part of my portfolio is finding issue areas where the United States and Australia don't already cooperate. And that may be overstating it a little bit, but it's true in some senses. So what do you see as the next steps in the U.S.-Australia relationship? What can we do to ensure that intimacy that you talked about we're in danger of losing with the minority government in Australia now?
Well, you know, I think the big structures of cooperation are there, but there are a whole lot of small things going forward. There's a defence cooperation treaty, which is really a defence trade treaty, which recently cleared the Foreign Relations Committee in the Senate. It would be a good thing if that were ratified by the US Congress. There's a similar treaty with Britain. The idea is that they'll be ratified both together. The idea is that Australia will have slightly better access to the US defence market. I can warmly assure you all that you will not be swamped with Australian fifth-generation jet fighters or Australian main battle tanks. There is a slight possibility that we may produce some of the rations that soldiers eat in Kandahar or something like that. I don't regard this as a serious threat to the American economy, and I'd urge the United States to proceed and ratify this treaty. While I've been here, I've found that there is actual talk in the American system of the possibility of greater military basing in Australia. That would be a very interesting proposal. Of course, anything short of the permanent deployment of 5,000 Marines will virtually go by unnoticed by the Australian public. If you home port a ship in Perth or something, nobody will notice. There'll be a few more Americans in the bars, but the public, broadly speaking, won't notice. And of course, the American sailors are always enormously popular with the public. There's no problem at that level. But if, for instance, somebody made a proposal that they wanted to have an American base in Darwin with 5,000 troops permanently stationed there and so on, that'd be quite a big issue in Australian politics, and it would be harder for a minority government to handle than it would be for a government of either side that was secure. I mean, the ideal formulation for that is to have a Labor government in office, because if they did it, the Conservative opposition could never possibly oppose it, and so it would have bipartisan support. But there are a million small things. I mean, another thing that Howard got out of the Bush administration was a terrific visa arrangement. And I'm sure you're all across that in the Homeland Security Department. But that's very, very practical, very lively. The people-to-people cooperation seems to be enormous. And I've discovered in my 2 months here that there's a formula for dealing with any technical problem you have as an Australian in America. You just say, excuse me, I'm an Australian, I don't understand these things. And the Americans who know Australia laugh at your brazenness, and the Americans who don't know Australia think you might represent a new minority that they haven't heard of, and therefore they better treat you with due consideration or they'll get sued. So I think it's a good news story for Australia, basically.
Greg, I'm Peter Gerritsen from Headquarters Air Force. So you had mentioned very prominently the Navy, although you've mentioned the F-22 a couple of times by name, and you'd recently mentioned basing. So I was going to ask you to just talk a little bit about your thoughts on the role and importance that the collaboration between our two air forces play and the kind of stability you'd like to see, and in particular how you might hear the talk about air-sea battle right now, which is in part aimed at reassuring our partners in the region. The second question I wanted to ask was, there have been a lot of changes, specifically with respect to the U.S. and Australian perceptions of and approachment to India. And so you hadn't mentioned too much about Australia looking at India, and I was curious what your thoughts were on there, particularly because they fall into this category right now of friends as opposed to hard ally, and where you'd like to see sort of that emerging security architecture go.
Well, let me take the second part of that first. I think India is an area where the US has had actually much better policy than Australia, much more far-sighted and much more effective. I was in India late last year, just after George W. Bush had been there. And I think the US Embassy was a bit astonished at how astoundingly popular Bush still is in India. And an Indian friend told me of a seminar he attended at which an Indian member of the audience got up and said, "Mr. President, I want to thank you for the US-India nuclear agreement. It's a great thing that you've done." And Mr. Bush said, "Yep, I sure broke a lot of China getting that agreement for you." Oops, maybe that was the wrong metaphor, he said. And the Indians, of course, appreciated this very deeply. But I think India is destined never to be a treaty ally of the United States, and that's the way it should be. India is going to be a great power. Everything you can say about China, you can say about India, except we have such an interest in India succeeding because India is a democracy, and in a civic sense, it embodies the virtues that we all believe in, democracy and human rights. Of course, it doesn't embody them perfectly, neither do we. But that is where its civic system is aiming, which is not where the civic system of the People's Republic of China is aiming. I'm not making any ethnic comments here. I don't make this a generalisation about Chinese people as opposed to Indian people, but just the government and the political system of China. India balances China simply by being India. All India has to do is be a success, and it balances China. Mind you, the Chinese often complain about being encircled. There was one marvellous People's Daily editorial which said China is being encircled by two giant crab claws, Japan and Australia. And I must say I was very chuffed at the thought that we 23 million Australians could encircle the 1.2 billion Chinese. And I've tried to engage in a policy of strategic reassurance since then that the Chinese don't have too much to fear from being overrun by hordes of wild Australians fleeing New Zealand, presumably. But at the same time, China has encircled India. China really has encircled India. Everywhere you look out from New Delhi, you see Chinese listening posts, Chinese-built ports, Chinese developing naval facilities, Chinese geostrategic influence in Pakistan, in Nepal, in Myanmar particularly, in Sri Lanka now after the recent agreement, and of course the Indian strategic discourse. You only have to scratch it about 0.5 millimetre and you get a pretty hysterical sense of the threat that China poses to them. And of course, the Indian nuclear deterrent is not directed at Pakistan, against whom India has a massive conventional advantage, and therefore nuclear weapons equalise the equation to India's disadvantage, but against China, with whom India has a massive conventional disadvantage, and so nuclear weapons equalise the equation to India's advantage. But I think the closest possible association that we can have, the United States and Australia, with India, is in everyone's benefit. That's why I think the Rudd government did make a very bad mistake in playing its part in the death of the quadrilateral security talks. Another bad element of Australian policy is the Rudd government reversed the Howard government's decision to sell uranium to India. And if Australia is going to become a strategic partner of India, it's going to be through uranium sales more than anything else, although we have a booming and huge trade with India and an enormous people-to-people exchange. But if we became part of the Indian nuclear fuel cycle, an integral part, we would have leverage with the Indians, which we certainly don't have now. We already do a massive amount in military cooperation. We do joint exercises, our SAS trains there, above the snow line and all that sort of thing. I know the US has very intimate military-to-military relations with India. And in a sense, you almost don't want to touch India because we don't want to somehow or other mismanage it. And I think American administrations, if anything, have not devoted enough attention to India, but on the other hand, I think they've been shrewd and sensible in not trying to overdo India. You don't want to make a crude effort to play the India card against China. India plays its own card just by being India. First part of your question, I apologise for not mentioning the Air Force properly in relation to the Navy. And of course, Australian cooperation with the US Air Force goes back as long as there's been a US Air Force, really. I don't know whether you'd care to license an export version of the F-22 and sell it to Japan and at an extreme discount to Australia. It'd have to be a pretty hefty discount, I think, for Australia to afford it, but I think the Japanese would have an interest in it. I do think, though, without pretending to any great depth of expertise about this, the Chinese anti-access and area denial strategy is profoundly troubling for the strategic stability of the Asia-Pacific. If the US forward military deployment is ever broken in the Asia-Pacific, then the results are utterly unpredictable, comprehensively unpredictable. Australia toyed with the nuclear weapons option itself deep into the 1960s. It was years after we signed the Non-Proliferation Treaty before we ratified it. We bought F-111s, which had the capability of taking nuclear weapons because that was still a live option when we bought them. Shows you how old the F-111s are. And I think we had our last F-111 flight the other day. And of course, that itself had fateful decisions because that really led to the Indonesian nuclear energy program. And I suppose when I say Navy, I really mean the whole maritime force in the Pacific, the Navy and the Marines, which are of course part of the Navy, and the Air Force together. As you know, we're planning to buy 100 Joint Strike Fighters, so it would be very beneficial if you would stop the cost of that going up too much and deliver them sometime soon so that we don't have to rely on our ageing Hornets to do the job. But you can see I'm just fumbling around here and I have nothing more intelligent to say, so I better stop speaking.
Did we have a question here? Yeah.
Mubahid Shah. You had earlier mentioned about the changing character of Islam in Southeast Asia. I think 50 years ago you would be knowing quite well that there was a Muslim insurgency during the Sukarno era called the Darul Islam. And I'm just wondering whether this is a reassertion of that old phenomena. And secondly, that the third largest communist party in the world was in Indonesia. under Edit, and this was depicted also in that movie, The Year of Living Dangerously. And I'm wondering that was one of the factors depicted as leading to and precipitating the ouster of Sukarno, because it also assumed an anti-Chinese phenomenon in Indonesia. Whether these two factors, how do they interact now? What are the dynamics of these two things? Thank you.
That's an extremely dangerous question, because I can bore the pants off you for hours on those subjects, because Indonesia is really my first love, and Christopher Koch, the author of that novel, is a great friend of mine. And of course it was Mel Gibson's first big movie before he went insane recently after, I think clearly as a result of living in America for too long. You know. He was a nice boy when he was in Australia, a very nice boy. But
oh dear.
a couple of points I'd make. One is Gemma Islamiyah is certainly the direct child of Darul Islam. No question about that. And in fact, in many cases, the members of Jemaah Islamiyah are the biological children of the leaders of Darul Islam. And there has always been that element within Indonesian life. There's no doubt about that. And stronger in some parts than other. In Aceh, of course, in the northern tip of Sumatra, traditionally a very independent-minded, strongly Islamist identity, really never accepted rule by the Dutch, really never accepted rule by the Indonesians, always wanted Sharia law and so forth. You know, the mention of 1965 in Indonesia, this is an episode in an era which deserves far wider knowledge and dramatisation and remembrance. A terrible episode in Indonesian history. At the time, of course, Indonesian communists were identified closely with ethnic Chinese Indonesians, and this led to, a horrible slaughter of Chinese Indonesians, horrible and unforgivable slaughter, really. But at the time, the three contending forces in Indonesia were the military, the Muslims and the communists, and the military and the Muslims basically slaughtered the communists. And you'll remember that Indonesia and China broke off diplomatic relations at that time, and the Chinese sent boats to rescue any Indonesian Chinese who wanted to leave. Now, there's a splendid Australian scholar of China, Wong Gungwu, who argues that there's a kind of functional equivalence between the 1965 bloodlettings in Indonesia and the Cultural Revolution in China. They were so traumatic and so terrible that they led to a broad acceptance by the people of authoritarian government in order to avoid great disorder. And in Wong Gungwu's analysis, that broke down when Suharto could no longer deliver economic growth. So avoiding disorder and delivering economic growth were the two bases of legitimacy for Suharto, just as economic growth and nationalism are the two bases of legitimacy for the Chinese Communist Party. However, although that existed in Indonesia's past, the character of Indonesian Islam was much less influenced by the Middle East. It had its own internal dynamic, and it had its own internal debates about whether you should have Sharia law and whether modernisation meant westernisation and so forth. But it was always a very diverse, syncretic kind of practice. Somebody put it to me once, Indonesians were Muslim in much the same way that Anglicans are sort of Anglicans, they're not too fussed about it, really, and the final piece of evidence I'd give you about this is that I'm very devoted to the 1950s and 60s movies of a Malay comedian, P.J. Rumley. He was the Jack Benny or Bob Hope of the Malay world in the 1950s and 60s. And his movies are marvellous. If you can ever get them on video, they're great with subtitles. They're just hilarious. They're tremendously entertaining, very funny movies. And they were set in Malaya, not Indonesia. But the Malayan society they depict of that time, all the blokes had a drink, all the girls were in cocktail frocks and had perms in their hair and so on. There wasn't a tudong or a Muslim headdress to be seen in any of these movies. Now, I don't suggest for a moment that everyone lived like they were in a P.J. Rumley movie, but these were legendary popular Malay movies of the time, and they certainly didn't give offence to anybody in Malaya at that time. There weren't popular demonstrations against P.J. Rumley. He was the hero of the Malay nation. Now, modern Malaysian movies are, in fact, the most boring films made anywhere in the entire world, and they always consist of perfectly Muslim-clad women in terribly pained love stories with extraordinarily devout Muslim Malay men who never drink and never smoke, never drink, and there's never an ethnic Chinese or an ethnic Indian in the whole movie. They are very bizarre cultural artefacts of today, and they represent to me not only an artistic but a social regression from where the society was in that particular dimension in the 50s and 60s. And certainly my friends in Malaysia and Indonesia feel that the tenor of Islam in their countries is becoming more conservative. That doesn't mean that they're becoming pro-terrorist, but they are becoming more conservative with a lot more overt religiosity in both countries.
Great, we've got time for one more. I think we're going to go up the gentleman in the stripy tie.
Hi, David Shambaugh from George Washington University. You mentioned in your opening comments that foreign policy didn't figure in the recent election discourse, but I'd like to ask you to discuss a little bit the spectrum of views in Australia about China and Australia's relations with China and where your views fit on that spectrum. I gather you've made a number of very critical comments about China this afternoon. How representative are those comments of the discourse in Australian society and government? I've just been reading Hugh White's quarterly essay currently. I don't know if you've seen that, but the two of you are at some variance, shall we say, again. Could you just talk, in the Lowy Institute polling recently is fascinating. It shows Australians really very confused and sort of all over the map about China. See China as the most important country to its future. 68% say China's about to attack Australia. So can you just talk a little bit about the spectrum of opinion in your country concerning relations with China?
Well, David, I think I represent pretty much the broad mainstream, absolutely dead centre. I think the consensus is that my views represent the most intelligent, and compelling, shared by all my countrymen, except a few captious critics. No, I'm just your regular panda hugger from down under, really. Well, let me start with the polling. I think polling on Australian attitudes to foreign affairs is almost completely worthless. It tells you nothing. Most Australians don't think about foreign affairs very much. So if you say to them, what is the biggest threat to your future? An earthquake, a financial disaster, or Lady Gaga? 30% of them will say Lady Gaga, and you can extrapolate from that anything you like. This Lowy poll, I think, is the work of the devil. It's completely meaningless, and it changes radically. The first time they did it, they had a list of 5 potential security threats, one of which was US foreign policy. And this led to a headline: 20% of Australians think US foreign policy is a threat to their security. I smashed them over the head in a few newspaper columns in a friendly, fraternal spirit of self-criticism and what have you. The next year they didn't include that question, and guess what? US foreign policy has never again come up as a dire threat to the Australian people. Views of China are very variable, both over time and within Australia, because it depends really what China's been up to that week. If China's having a brawl with Japan like it's been having last week, it'll probably get bad consequences. If the headlines have been that we've just signed a $30 billion natural gas deal with China, probably get good marks in the polls that week. But I don't think our policymakers are remotely influenced by these polls, and I think the only people who are influenced by the Lowy poll really are the people who receive a paycheck from Lowy. The spectrum of views about China, it's less diverse than it seems. There really is in practice no difference between the Labor Party and the Liberal Party in how they deal with China when they're in office. When they're in opposition, they're honour bound to say whatever the government is doing is wrong. So either the government is being too pro-China or too anti-China. And if you're a creative opposition, you can say both things at the same time. The Liberal Party, which is our right-of-centre party, we do this to confuse Americans. We call our Conservative Party the Liberal Party. And they're liberal in the sense that Lloyd George was, I guess. But they criticised Kevin Rudd for criticising China over human rights, which was truly a bizarre position for them to take, and they copped a shellacking from a number of commentators, and then they retreated. But there is not any serious disagreement because the policy never changes. We want to make money out of China and we don't want it to cause us trouble. Our policy is pretty simple, and we're not ever going to compromise the integrity of the US-Australia alliance for any desire that China might have. I personally regard Hugh White's paper as the stupidest single strategic document ever written in Australian history. But that is a personal and idiosyncratic view, and I think other people haven't been so understated and restrained as I have been. But his document argues that the single greatest threat to stability in the Asia-Pacific is American strategic primacy and the unwillingness of America to give up strategic primacy in Asia, and that the primary goal of Australian foreign policy should be to convince the United States to give up strategic primacy in Asia. Well, I tell you, that'll get you a few marks from the Green Party, but it has zero influence on Australian foreign policy. Everybody has a slightly schizophrenic attitude to China. They want to encourage the good, they want to engage, they want China to succeed, they're happy to make money out of China, they're happy for China to make money out of us. All that's great. We all have love and respect for Chinese culture and civilization. That's all terrific. Australia is a very China-influenced society. A lot of the Southeast Asians who've come to Australia are in fact Chinese. We've got a very big Taiwanese community, a very long historic connection with Hong Kong, and a lot of mainland Chinese coming as students and as tourists. But the minute China engages in strategic assertiveness, our response is automatically that we're in solidarity with the Americans. We don't like dictatorships. You know, people sometimes say, well, would we back the Americans if there was a conflict over Taiwan with China? Believe me, public opinion would polarise in about 7 seconds if the great big dictatorship of China attacked the small little democracy of Taiwan. It would take us about 7 seconds to work out whose side we were on. And it really doesn't matter what a few unemployed strategic analysts. You see, the other thing is we don't have the think tank culture of America. Anyone who's in a think tank in Australia is basically someone who can't get a job in government under either side. It's not like your system where, you know, the Republicans are in office, so the Democrats go and hide in CSIS or something, and then the Democrats get into the office and they all come back as deputies and assistants and unders and so on. That doesn't happen in Australia. We have a Westminster system. If you're not working in the system, you basically can't get a job. And so you end up in a think tank talking rubbish, basically. And there is enormous support for the Chinese economic relationship, especially amongst businesses who make money out of China. But businesses are often overly optimistic about the geostrategic consequences of business. You remember the book, was it by Norman Angell, who argued just prior to World War I that the European economies were so integrated that there could never again be conflict between the major European powers, published this book just absolutely on the eve of World War I. So far, no one in the business community has ever, as far as I can recall, argued that we should compromise in any way our relationship with the United States in order to curry favour with China. John Howard had a very simple formula for this. He just said to the Chinese, look, if you want to have a good conversation with me, talk about trade. If you want to have a miserable conversation, talk about the alliance with the United States. And after a while, the Chinese stopped talking about the alliance. On the other hand, Australians can be very cowardly about human rights. And that's why it's very important that America continue to give the leadership on this, because our position will always tend to reflect what the American position is, simply because America is so much stronger and more powerful than we are. So if the President sees the Dalai Lama, so will the Prime Minister. If the President and the Secretary of State raise human rights, so will our Prime Minister. And if the Chinese complain, we'll say, well, you know, the Americans do it as well, so it must be acceptable. But if the Americans stop doing it, we're not going to be defending a piece of land which the Americans have abandoned. So I don't think that makes us, you know, complete sycophants or utterly dependent on the Americans. It's simply power realities. You know, we're a nation of 23 million people. We're not going to pick a fight with the Chinese that we can avoid on our own. On the other hand, they pick fights with us quite often. We had the Uyghur leader, Rabia Kadir, visit our country last year, and there was a film about her at the Melbourne Film Festival. The Chinese went bananas. They demanded that the government refuse her a visa. They ran cyber attacks against the Melbourne Film Festival. And of course, with their normal exquisite brilliance at these things, they turned her from a completely unknown personality. Nobody had ever heard of Rabia Kadir in Australia. They probably gave her $5 billion worth of publicity. You know, by the end of it, she was being mobbed as a movie star. She was an absolute icon of liberty in Australia, and that's all as a consequence of the Chinese government overreaction. Now, the Australian government then had very intense dialogue with the Chinese and said, for God's sake, this is counterproductive from your own interests. And then when our TV broadcast the movie which they'd objected to, they didn't make any fuss about it. So when it was seen by a couple of hundred people at a film festival, it was a massive international incident. When it was seen by a couple of million people on TV, it was no incident. And it was simply up to the Chinese government whether it decided to make it an incident or not. So there appears to be a lot of diversity about views about China in Australia, and there is, but at the end of the day, it's not ever going to affect, all this diversity doesn't ever seem to affect the actions of the Australian government, which are really remarkably consistent in their strategic continuity.
Great, we've gone over time, so I'd like to thank Greg for being so restrained and unopinionated in his comments.
That's true.
If you could join me in thanking him.
Thanks, Clive. Are you coming to the dinner?
Yes, I am.
Oh, very good. Very good.